Have I got a treat of a Locked On Kings podcast for you today? Partially because we're not actually talking about actual Kings basketball, but mainly because Sam Amick of The Athletic, one of the best and most connected national NBA reporters, is joining us in the heat of trade deadline rumors. He's going to talk a lot of Kings basketball, give us an update on the Ben Simmons situation, talk about the value of De'Aaron Fox compared to Ben Simmons amongst value of other Kings players on the trade market. And he'll fill us in on the pressure that is on Kings general manager Monte McNair, whether or not his job is on the line if the Kings don't make big moves and actually make the playoffs. It's all on this must-listen episode of the Locked On Kings podcast.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time. Time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season and all off season. If you're looking for in-depth analysis, game-by-game breakdowns, highlights, interviews with local and national experts, full coverage of your Sacramento Kings from January through December, this is the place for you, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, prizepicks.com. Go there right now, use promo code NBA or go to your app store and download the app today. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I've been a Sacramento sports media member for the last 7 years. This is my 8th season covering Kings basketball, formerly for Sacramento Sports Radio, now with ABC 10 News and Television here in the California capital. And thank goodness for today's podcast. Thank goodness for this interview with Sam Amick to take the bad taste out of my mouth of the Kings getting absolutely obliterated by the Boston Celtics. And if you want to watch a depressing podcast after that Celtics loss, go and check out yesterday's episode. And so many of you continue to tune in, continue to support despite this team being not just borderline, just completely unwatchable at this point in time. And I appreciate you so much. So I'm rewarding you, and I've been rewarded myself with the opportunity to speak to Sam here today. So much great stuff that we're going to get into. I teased a little bit of it in that intro, but he's going to share with us the values around the league of De'Aaron Fox, Tyrese Haliburton, Harrison Barnes, Marvin Bagley, Buddy Hield. He's going to talk about the latest with the Ben Simmons situation, whether or not Daryl Morey is bluffing or not when it comes to the Sixers holding on to Ben Simmons until this upcoming offseason in an attempt to go after James Harden. He's going to fill us in on Monte McNair's current situation, how firing Monte McNair would be a really poor reflection on Kings ownership and how that's something that they have to consider, how McNair's seat could be hot, the amount of pressure on McNair to make a big move. There is so much stuff in this half-an-hour interview. I have no time to waste at all. So without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with The Athletic's Sam Amick. It's difficult enough for me to follow one NBA team during the chaos and fun that is NBA trade deadline time, but imagine following the entire league. Thankfully, I don't have to because we have amazing journalists out there like Sam Amick of The Athletic. It has been a while since Sam has blessed us here on the Locked On Kings podcast, and I managed to snag him during maybe the busiest time of the year. And if you're not familiar with Sam, the local reporter, in addition to the national reporter, Sam has roots and deep ties here in Sacramento, formerly with the Sacramento Bee. So in terms of trustworthy national reporting when it comes to the Sacramento Kings, there's probably not a better man out there. Sam, welcome back to Locked On Kings, my friend. I appreciate you taking the time. We just had a nice lengthy off-air discussion on Barry Bonds not making it into the Hall of Fame. So you're opinionated about everything, and I know you'll be able to weigh in a little bit on what's going on here in Sacramento.
Thanks for having me, Matt. I hope you don't mind the casual attire that I'm rocking today. It's a casual day at the Amick household, but yeah, maybe we'll do a baseball pod on the side one of these days. That was a good little Bonds discussion we had. Not what they're here to listen to, but you guys. So let's talk some hoops.
You'd be surprised. A lot of Kings fans at this point in time seemingly would want to talk about anything but the Kings just based off of their 53-point loss the other night this team incapable of even understanding the term defense, let alone knowing how to play it. This team has its fair share of problems, to say the absolute least, Sam. And you know as well as everybody does that the Kings' goal this season has always been playoffs. And that's a goal that Monte McNair talked about, a goal that Luke Walton, when he was still here, talked a lot about. We know the Kings are staring the wrong kind of history in the face with the longest ever NBA playoff drought. So it's not surprising when McNair did a recent interview with Carmichael Dave on Sports 1140 KHTK saying that the goal was still to go for the playoffs. It's not surprising necessarily to see the Kings involved in all of these rumors, especially the Ben Simmons sweepstakes. You and Shams reported, I think last week, that, and you said this actually on a podcast, that Ben Simmons was kind of option or goal number one, and then Domantas Sabonis was kind of their fallback plan B. Am I saying that right? And is that still the plan as far as you know?
I think things have evolved. Jeremy Grant's another guy that the Kings have been tied to. But the Simmons landscape, not just for the Kings, but I think, honestly, most teams pursuing him has gotten, more and more complicated. People feeling like the Sixers are very likely to hold on to him. Shams and I reported on Monday that they have some optimism in Philly about the idea of maybe landing James Harden this summer in a sign-in trade, and that might disincentivize them to go ahead and do a deal now. So for sure, I do believe the Kings are still engaged on the Simmons front. I was told definitively that they would not be taking back Tobias Harris. That has been reported differently elsewhere. Like always, we'll see what kind of comes out in the wash. But, I do think players like that are front and center, probably some others that we are missing under the radar. The Kings aren't bashful about telling you at minimum that they will be involved in a situation that involves any kind of impact player. And that does, I think, speak to just the level of urgency around their situation for sure. They feel like they've got to get something done here.
On the Simmons standpoint, I had a natural skepticism. We know Daryl Morey's been very vocal and very public with everything going on in this Ben Simmons negotiation sweepstake around the league, not just with the Sacramento Kings. But I had a natural skepticism when I heard this idea or preference of holding on to Simmons until this offseason to try and do that Harden sign and trade like you mentioned, because I look at the 76ers right now, and even though they're not necessarily at the top of the standings in the Eastern Conference, they have a Joel Embiid playing on an MVP level. There is a window available to them to compete right now, and I wonder how willing they are to maybe waste an opportunity like that to hang on to Simmons, have this asset that's just sitting on your bench when you could use him to clearly improve right away. Do you think this is a bluff that Morey potentially needs to be called on, or do you think this is legitimate? The Sixers are very comfortable with the idea of hanging on to him and taking the bump maybe immediately to set themselves up for a golden offseason?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's always hard with this job. We don't run around with lie detectors. You know what I mean? It's hard to know is true and what's not. I will say that, trying to follow my own instincts, like always, I would venture to believe the Philly stance right now regarding them waiting for this summer, not just for James, but Damian Lillard's situation could be different at that point. Bradley Beal, Jaylen Brown, players like that. The market right now with, what's available to them, I would probably argue, as far as the main players that might be the centerpieces of a Simmons deal, it's more like top 50 players, top 60 players than it is top 30, which is what they were hoping to get going into this thing. Top 30, of course, being, basically all-star. I think a guy like Sabonis is, right there on the fringe. You could maybe argue De'Aaron Fox, although, not, this year, probably in that top 50, top 60 range. But I think they are serious about waiting until this summer. And part of our reporting was me being told from a very good source on that side that Daryl does have full backing of ownership to go past this deadline. I also think, one thing that gets overlooked here, and I understand it might be a little counterintuitive, but, stick with me on this kind of thread, is that Joel Embiid is playing at an incredibly high level. And a lot of people's reaction to that has been to say, gosh, he's so great. Get him some help so you can win a title. I actually am starting to feel like it might actually have the reverse effect, which is Joel, I think, is enjoying the hell out of having the spotlight to himself right now. And he's, you see Shaq on TNT, Shaquille O'Neal on TNT all the time. When he analyzes big fellas, what does he talk about? Like, get in the paint, put your hand up, old style bully ball, do your thing. And almost nobody plays that way anymore. Well, here's Joel Embiid out there 4 consecutive games, 40 points, 10 rebounds, playing, Wilt Chamberlain coming up in terms of historical context of things that Joel is doing. And I kind of feel like if you're Joel, you might just, roll the dice this year, get all these individual accolades showing people how incredibly dominant you are, assert yourself as the franchise centerpiece, make sure that is not in question. Then by the time the next guy rolls around, whoever the heck that co-star winds up being, if it's, James Harden or somebody else, then the ecosystem in Philly, I think, is almost more crystal clear, if that makes sense. So, that to me is actually partly why Joel has patience here. He's publicly talked about the fact that he doesn't think they should do a move. He's backing Daryl Morey. That's giving the organization in negotiations. And I actually think it's real. So, we'll see how it plays out.
Today's episode of Locked On Kings brought to you by Prize Picks. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, Prize Picks is the best NBA daily fantasy sports prop game on the market, and it's not even close. Prize Picks offers more NBA props than any other DFS prop operator and offers all the superstar players as well as bench players, only recording a handful of minutes each game. Prize Picks offers any prop that you can think of: points, assists, rebounds, threes made, etc. It has it all. And the way you play on Prize Picks, it's pretty simple. You pick 2 to 5 players and an over/under on their projections for the stat of your choosing. You can win up to 10 times on any entry, and it's just you versus the projected numbers. You're not going against any sharks out there in Vegas who just make a living off of taking advantage. But you have a great sports knowledge, especially if you voluntarily follow the Sacramento Kings. So use that sports knowledge to cash in on Prize Picks. And make sure when you go to prizepicks.com today or go to your app store and download the app, you use promo code NBA when you sign up. You will get $50 for free if your first Prize Pick entry scores a single point, which is super easy to do. It's free money. That's right. All users that deposit use promo code NBA will get $50 for free if your first Prize Pick entry scores a single point. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. Going back to the Kings, you've reported that nobody is necessarily listed as untouchable with this Kings team. We've heard De'Aaron Fox's name be brought up in a lot of discussions, a lot of rumors, and the general consensus, at least for me here in Sacramento, is if the Kings want to get the talent that they're looking for, they're going to have to give up talent to do it. Now, we also know that if McNair is going to move on from one of De'Aaron Fox or Tyrese Haliburton, it's going to be probably a significant haul in return, maybe almost an offer you can't refuse type deal to get that move done. But then there's a recent report from The Athletic that the Kings are willing to commit to and are committing to keeping De'Aaron Fox and Tyrese Haliburton together, building around that duo. Is that the Kings setting up a fallback in the case that they can't move on from De'Aaron Fox to appease their star and not piss him off with the fact that he's been potentially shopped and he's been involved in rumors? Or do you see that as this Kings team is still committed to this group despite how poor this team has been?
No, I think it's not probably. My strong sense, it's the former of the two options that you kind of laid out there. It's the idea that I think they are reacting to the market, meaning, if you have 3 or 4 or 5 trades that you wanted to explore in front of you, and they included somebody like De'Aaron Fox, you then proceeded to have dialogue with each of those 5 teams, get clarity on the fact that De'Aaron and whatever else was very likely not going to get any of those deals done. At that point, from a internal politics standpoint, you have an issue because your main player's name has been out there for quite some time. So I think then you do start cleaning up the mess in terms of the relationship dynamics. To me, that's what that was. But you don't do that unless you are reasonably confident about the market. Like you're putting yourself out there a bit to say De'Aaron's not going anywhere. because you just, what's out there. You know what you can't get done. And now it does look like De'Aaron will probably stick around. Now, could something change? 100%. I mean, I don't remember a trade deadline where, there's been so much chatter, mainly because of the Ben Simmons stuff, like so far in advance of the deadline. Like we still got 13 days to go. It feels like the deadline should be tomorrow. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So still a lot of time, but for now, I think, to me, it's the politics internally that the Kings are trying to manage.
And through that entire time before we actually get to the trade deadline itself on the 10th, the Kings still have 8 more games to play. And Sam, I've been calling all season long.
Do they have to?
I know, right? Can you just forfeit them now and save us all this trouble? I've been calling all season long for McNair to make a swing for the fences move. It's really one of the few things that the Kings haven't necessarily tried during this entire playoff drought. And I still see the value in that swing for the fences move, that all-in type gamble. But at the same time, too, with how this team is sliding recently, they're now, I think, 3.5, 4 games back of the Portland Trailblazers in just the 10th seed, let alone the actual playoff picture itself. We're just talking the play-in at this point. The Kings are falling out of it. If McNair continues to wait, and maybe it's not his choice to wait, you have to have 2 to tango. But if McNair waits till February 10th with the stretch this Kings team is currently in, tough opponents coming up, they might be out of the picture, even if they were able to pull off a Ben Simmons swing for the fences. That it just might be too deep of a hole for them to climb out of. So I've talked about the potential of the Kings transitioning away from that swing for the fences towards more of a, hey, let's look towards the draft, not necessarily tanking, but try and use assets that you have here that you're going to move on from to try and get young players or draft picks and look to build around that Fox Haliburton core for next season. I say all that to say I initially have a skepticism that McNair is able to make that decision because of the pressure of this team to make the playoffs. It's not only coming from ownership, that's coming from history, that's coming from the fan base. In your mind, have you heard anything or have any reason to believe that McNair's job is potentially reliant on the Kings making the playoffs this year?
I just think in general terms that he's under a lot of pressure. Now, there's been, if you come to the organization with specific questions about how that pressure is being framed, meaning, there has been chatter out there that, okay, if they don't do a big deal, does Monte out this summer? That has been denied by the organization. Those types of parameters. What they don't deny is that there's pressure on everybody, and of course they will dole that out. But it's like, okay, let's break it down. Is there pressure on the coaching staff? Well, no, because they already fired the head coach. So that box has already been checked. And of course, Alvin Gentry would like to keep this job, but it's not the same as Monte McNair, trying to be the GM of this team for a very long time. The owner's not going anywhere, despite what a lot of fans would like. And so in the players, it just becomes a case of they're not even controlling their own fate. There's pressure on the players, but they're not in control. So really the only guy with control and really, kind of skin of the game, if you will, it's Monte. And so, yeah, there is a lot of pressure. And I think that, if the deadline comes and goes and there's no fireworks at all with this roster, I don't know. I don't know what Vivek Ranadive is going to do. I know that, and there's situations like this all over the league. A lot of times when certain people are on the verge of getting fired, the person doing the potential firing has to also look in the mirror and think about what the conversation is going to sound like and be like if you make that move. Down in LA, for example, Frank Vogel has come very close to losing his job as the head coach of the Lakers. The second that Rob Pelinka fires Frank Vogel, if that does happen, then what do people talk about? Rob and the job he did with the roster. Now, in Sacramento, I would argue that because they already fired the coach, it's that scenario, but it's already one level higher. So if you fired Monte McNair, after kind of forcing Vlade Divac out, after Pete D'Alessandro, after all these front office changes, then what are the fans and media going to talk about? You go one ratchet higher and you talk about the owner. So, I think those things are a big part of the calculus. The history, though, of the franchise and the playoff drought that is just looming so large over them. I mean, I've never seen anything like it, just from a human standpoint of the people within the organization trying to do their best in 2022, 2021, 22, but also knowing like, good Lord, like people are upset going back to 2006. This is a lot to process. We weren't even here yet. There's some of that. And it's hard, and I know I'm rambling on you, Matt, but last night I'm watching the Timberwolves game, and Anthony Edwards is just putting on a special performance and doing incredible things. And I'm watching, now granted, they're around 500, but it's a hell of a lot better than the Kings. And that's an organization that has one playoff appearance in the entire span since, roughly since the Kings have had their playoff drought. A lot of parallels between Minnesota and Sacramento. And out in Minnesota, you're going, wow, I think they finally found a player who is kind of wired in the kind of way that can pierce through all that and maybe pull them out of this darkness, and maybe do it along with Karl Anthony Towns. And Chris Finch is a good coach. And so they're starting to see some light. And then out in Sacramento, they're getting drubbed by 50 points to the Celtics in Boston. And it's just wild how, it's been such a dark stretch, and it doesn't seem any better anytime soon.
Sorry to interrupt my conversation with Sam Amick, but I got to tell you about Built Bar, and I think Sam Amick needs to hear about Built Bar himself. I have to actually ask him next time I get the opportunity to see him if he's familiar with Built Bar, because this is a bar that's not only making its way around, of course, all the listeners of the Locked On Kings podcast, all the hosts of the Locked On Kings podcast. I'm starting to see Built Bars all over the world of professional sports, seeing athletes eat them. That's because Built Bars are protein bars that taste like candy bars. It gives you that chocolate, it gives you that deliciousness that you enjoy without having a bar that is bad for you, compared to candy bars that have on average 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, dozens of net carbs. Most Built Bars have 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein, and they're covered in 100% chocolate. There's also a wide variety of them, a bunch of different flavors for you to try. If you go to Built.com, order a mixed box, they'll send you a bunch of different bars for you to try out, and the next time you order a box, you can pick and choose the bars that you want, and they'll send them directly to you. When you do order on Built.com, make sure you use promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Of course, Monty's not to blame for all 15 years of this drought, but he's now had 1.5 full off seasons as he was hired halfway through a couple off seasons ago. How do you assess, Sam, the job that Monty has done? He's had 2 trades that pretty much fell through. The Bogdanovic sign and trade with Milwaukee that definitely would have made this team better. The whole Kings-Lakers saga on draft night that saw the Wizards swoop in and dish Russell Westbrook, and they're loving that trade for them. So you have that. You have him drafting Tyrese Haliburton, which is a big win, but then the next year drafting Davion Mitchell when your 2 best players are already ball handling guards. And then you have pretty much after that, he's kind of sat on his hands. He's done a lot of nothing, at least recently. His moves at the last trade deadline, he called accumulating assets, hasn't paid off for this team at all. And we could, there are a lot of arguments in Sacramento that the Kings would have been better kind of tanking or not going for it last year and putting themselves in a better position this year, which obviously they didn't do, and they aren't in a better position. How do you assess McNair's job so far as the guy in Sacramento?
I mean, it's been a mixed bag, obviously, and the tough part for Monty right now is that it is fair to say that, whether you say that he's been keeping his powder in his gun or he's been sitting on his hands, that's a matter of perspective. You know what I mean? And also the one thing he had going for him, at least last season, was that the draft had gone well, and now all of a sudden, there's not as much buzz around Tyrese Haliburton because the team is struggling so much. He has good nights. He's a good player, but the hope, which bad teams need their fans to have hope, the hope that came with Tyrese last year, and tell me if you disagree, Matt, is just not there this year. It doesn't feel like he's, like we talk about Anthony Edwards, like those 2 players are just light years apart in terms of their ability to lead a franchise out of the darkness. So the buzz is being, down on Tyrese doesn't help when it comes to the optics around Monty. And then Davion Mitchell, when they took him, I did respect the kind of the ethos behind it, if you will, and the idea that they went for best player after a very well chronicled Vlade Divac passes on Luka Doncic, goes for Marvin Bagley, mainly because of fit. So the idea was like, you can't get mad at one GM for going for fit over talent, and then get mad at the next guy because he went talent over fit. Well, I mean, welcome to Sacramento, where it cuts the wrong way every time for everybody. And right now it looks like a tough pick because unless they move De'Aaron or Tyrese, you have a backlog of wings. You have politics within all that, where I think Davion, people forget, Davion's a rookie, but he's 23 years old. Like, he's ready to play big minutes right now, and I think he would be just fine if some playing time kind of broke free at the trade deadline with somebody moving on. And so it's just not worked out very well, and he has not played as well, for most of the season. And so it's been a rough go for Monty, and it's all kind of led up to this period where, you can certainly save it all if you get some trade that you knock out of the park, but that's easier said than done.
I'm going to fire some names on this Kings roster that are more than likely on the block, maybe some of them not on the block. It's always difficult to gauge player value. It changes by the day, by the hour, by the minute, it seems, as the deadline gets closer and closer. But the first two that I want to start out with are De'Aaron Fox and Tyrese Haliburton, and I mainly want to compare the two of them. Because we've heard Fox's name floated out. In a hypothetical scenario where the Kings had to choose between the two, I personally feel the Kings would choose Haliburton. It was Monty's pick. He's younger, contractual control, all those reasons to go with Haliburton. Not necessarily the better player than Fox right now, but comparing values in your mind, do you think one carries more value over the other on the trade market, Fox and Haliburton?
I would probably argue that Haliburton does right now. Although it's a tricky calculus because the financial component is really the only reason that it's a discussion. De'Aaron's more at the moment, but he's coming at at 10 times the cost. You know what I mean? And that kind of commitment, I don't know what Tyrese's number is on that rookie contract, but it's obviously, several multiples, fewer than De'Aaron's. So I also think that in general, De'Aaron just hasn't, if he was playing this season to put on a show for everybody else in the league to want to come get him, that hasn't happened. He's had some moments, but it's just, he's not the guy that, where again, like Tyrese, the buzz is not what it once was with De'Aaron. I know this is probably maybe not fair, but I keep thinking about last season when my colleague and friend Amin El-Hassan had got a lot of blowback from Kings fans when he talked about Ja Morant, being the player that De'Aaron Fox thought he was, and that analysis. While listen, if you're De'Aaron, I understand that you're saying, why do I got to catch strays? Just say that Ja is great. I get that, but it does underscore the reality that for a minute, De'Aaron, we thought, might have been the kind of player to do what Ja is doing in Memphis. And he's just not. It's just all there is to it. He's not. And that is just a massive, massive miss for the Kings if that continues to be the case. Because you could even take it back to Luka. Like the idea that, Vlade, 100%, he thought so highly of De'Aaron that he didn't want to be forced to trade De'Aaron because he was going to bring Luka to town. That all hinged on De'Aaron being special. And he has not been special. He's been good at times, but he's not been special. So that's where I think, to your question, Tyler, value, because you know how executives think, like, there's nothing worse than, a potential being proven wrong, which is where we're getting with De'Aaron in the conversation. Not all the way, but in terms of like what people thought he could be versus what he appears to be. We're a lot closer to the end of that analysis than we are with Tyrese, where you can still kind of think and wonder 3 years down the road what's going to happen with his body. What kind of leader is he become? He's so young. He's got so much raw skill. So to me, Tyrese still gives you more of that optimism if you're trading for him.
Back at the beginning of the season, I worked a Kings Jazz game. I was working with the Utah Jazz radio team, and David Locke, the play-by-play broadcaster, said that Harrison Barnes, he believes, is a missing piece on a championship or a deep playoff team. And it's no surprise that the Jazz are reportedly interested in Harrison Barnes, and HB, I think, could provide a lot of value for a lot of teams out there that are looking to bolster that position. What kind of return and what kind of value would you expect Harrison Barnes to have out there? And have you heard any particular interest in him specifically?
Yeah, no, I know David well, and I don't know if I'm breaking any Locked On rules here, but the namesake of your fine pod, of course. Well, so I can't advance that storyline because Utah is literally the only team that I've heard specifically in terms of interest with Harrison. So that is very real. I don't know what kind of price tag there might be. Now, Boston's another one that I don't know about, where that's at right now. I do know for sure that over the course of the past couple of years that Boston was a team that had a lot of interest in Harrison. But, don't get excited about them giving up, any of their main guys for Harrison Barnes. It would have to be pieces around the edges. But his reputation is good. It's kind of a hybrid between Tyrese and De'Aaron, meaning it's not about what he could be at all. We know what Harrison Barnes is. And he's a professional who, first of all, as a teammate, you just can't find anybody to say bad things about him. In terms of the way he carries himself within the organization, nothing but A+ marks from people who have had him. And then, he's a guy who can defend multiple positions, who can obviously get hot and give you 25, 30 a night every so often. Or I guess 25, 30 every so often, not a night. So he's a good player, and he's got championship caliber. Everybody kind of forgets he won that ring with the Warriors. So I think he'll draw interest, but he's not so much of a game changer that, like, if the Kings' only move at this deadline is to move Harrison for something, I certainly don't think it's the kind of trade that is going to propel them to the playoffs.
And it might be a combination of trades that not necessarily propels them to the playoffs, but like we talked about earlier, it sets them up for maybe a slight retool and put themselves in a better position with a little more optimism heading into the offseason and into next season while continuing to lose and securing a top draft pick. So maybe you can move HB with that. Sam, you've been so generous with your time. I'm going to sneak 3 more names here. I don't expect answers for all 3, but Richaun Holmes, Buddy Hield, Marvin Bagley, those are three other names. 2 in particular, Buddy and Bagley, we know are pretty heavily on the Kings trading block. Any buzz around them? Anything worthy of note for any of those guys around the rumor mill?
Just the usual stuff that you've already read. I mean, with Buddy, you wonder about Philly. If there was a Simmons deal to be had, I think Buddy would likely be a part of that. To give Philly some more shooting. With Marvin, Detroit gets mentioned more than any other team. New Orleans is another team that I don't know exactly where they're at, but I can safely kind of share that they've poked around, I guess, about Marvin and find him interesting. They're good pieces, you know what I mean? Like I talked to somebody the other day about this, how like it's wild that a team like the Kings could be so bad collectively, but then when you look at their players as trade assets, and you envision, let's say Richaun Holmes on a decent team, or even Bagley. I mean, it's, these guys are going to wind up helping another team most likely. And that's what's going to drive Kings fans crazy because how many times have you seen a guy who just didn't, like a George Hill, right? Who goes somewhere else and plays out of his mind and wasn't very good when he was in the Kings jersey. Again, I always wind up doing Kings interviews and feeling so depressed for the fans on the back end because all these trends are just as old as time and they don't change. But, those guys will draw interest for sure.
Well, Sam, to add to that depression really, really quickly, you're very familiar with the teams, with the rosters that this Kings organization has had during this entire playoff drought. And what's most frustrating about this season, this is, to me personally, one of the most frustrating seasons of Kings basketball that I've ever lived through and covered. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I think this is the most talented roster, player for player, that the Kings have had during this playoff drought, even more than the Cousins, Rudy Gay, Isaiah Thomas, and nothing else Kings roster of a number of years ago. So the fact that this group clearly can't figure out how to play together despite having so much talent just drives Kings fans to want to pull their hair out. Do you agree with that assessment, having known all these rosters that they've put together, or do you think there are other teams that were better suited for brighter days than this group?
No, I think the one you mentioned I would take over this one for sure. DeMarcus and Rudy and Isaiah, Rudy's still doing his thing with Utah. Isaiah's obviously out the league, but talented player, and a guy who just did special things in Boston. And then DeMarcus, in terms of just sheer dominance, he had stretches where we talked earlier about Joel Embiid and him being able to enjoy all of his superpowers. There was obviously a stretch when DeMarcus lived that kind of an existence with the Kings. They might lose the game, but he's giving you monster numbers. So to me, that trio should have been better, should have won more than they did. And I think he's more talented than this group. But with this current group, for me, it just goes back to Fox. I don't know how, I can't put my finger on it in terms of, why it hasn't worked out. It does, and this is not just a De'Aaron thing, but with some of the guys on this roster, not the Rashawn Holmeses or guys like that, and Tyrese is still on the younger end, but man, it just feels like some of these guys they're comfortable enough, making the money they make. Yeah, they have the disappointment of the fans, but you're not in New York. You don't have to you every day. As long as you stay, you're not going to get too caught up in it. I don't know. There's just something in the water out here that is not getting the best out of the players that come through town. And I'm not sure how they fix it.
Sam, you're in the Golden One Center for a lot of games, even when the team's not good. So one day we look forward to having you in when the team is a little bit more enjoyable, or a lot of bit more enjoyable than they are right now. But I really appreciate your time. Speaking of enjoyable, having you on Locked On Kings, especially right now during this time of the year, is an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. I look forward to doing it again in the future. I hope you get some sleep, and hopefully you're breaking some good news on the Kings side here sooner rather than later.
Appreciate you, man.
I can't stress to you how much of a treat it is to have Sam Amick on around this time of the year. It's been too long since I've had him on. Hopefully we'll get him on in the near future rather than later, but to get him and to have even half an hour of his time is a real treat. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to respond to the things that Sam and I discussed, there's a lot in there to unpack. Please do so. You can do that on Twitter, at Matt George Sack, SAC. My email address is mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. Or if you're watching on YouTube, the YouTube comment section goes crazy every single episode. I appreciate you so much. Plenty to respond to in regards to this conversation with Sam Amick. Get loose, leave your thoughts down there. I really would appreciate that. I appreciate your support as always. The Kings play the Atlanta Hawks tonight. Who the hell cares? If there's anything worth mentioning for this game, I'll talk about it on an episode of the podcast tomorrow. But obviously what is happening off the floor, what's happening in trade rumors, and what Sam Amick could share with us is going to be far more interesting than anything the Kings do on the floor in Atlanta tonight. And that includes if they somehow find a way to win this game. So who knows what's going to happen there? Who knows what's going to happen in the trade market? But whatever happens, we, of course, will talk about it here on Locked On Kings. Appreciate your support. Can't wait to have you join me on the next episode. Until then, my name is Matt George. You have been listening to Locked On Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.